Hello, and welcome back to Political Science 201. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 2. All right, we had completed our discussion of the things that most framers of the Constitution agreed with. And the last thing that we spoke of was this concept of individualism and how complicated that concept is. So let's continue now. And let me tell you something that shocks many of my students. The framers of the Constitution, the people who wrote the Constitution, feared too much democracy. Now, you say, oh, Dr. Traylor, that can't be right. I've been taught all of my life that democracy is the most precious attribute of the American political system. Well, that's true today, but that has not always been true. Some of our most famous founding fathers did not really like the idea of the common man, the common people, the riffraff, what some of them referred to as the great unwashed. They really didn't think that those people should have too much of a voice in government. They were ignorant. Now, ignorant is not the same as stupid, is it? Stupid means that you're incapable of learning. Ignorant means that you simply don't know, but you can be taught, right? Many of you, when you walked into this classroom, were ignorant of the Constitution, uh, meaning that you simply didn't know the content. Hopefully, by the time the course is over, you will no longer be ignorant of the content of the Constitution. You will know it from the very first word to the very last word. But many of the framers of the Constitution really didn't trust uh, the common man to have a significant role in government. So it should be noted that contrary to what we've been taught, that authentic democracy is a rather recent development in the United States. Now, the word democracy denotes that the people, that's the demo part. That demo, D-E-M-O, is a Greek word that simply means the people. So government by the people, what was it Lincoln said? By the people, for the people, of the people, whatever that was. That is a rather new concept in American history. We often refer to our system of government as representative democracy. But even one of the most basic components of democracy, the idea of what is called a universal suffrage. Now that's a fancy word. Suffrage means having the right to vote. And universal suffrage means everybody can vote, right? Even that idea has only recently been achieved. Now I want you to think about this carefully, please. At the very beginning of our country, who could vote? Or it might be easier to ask the question, who could not vote? Well, women couldn't vote. Uh, Half the population is female, and yet women could not vote. About 20% of the population was black, and most of those were slaves. And slaves certainly could not vote. Uh, Tens of thousands of people living in what became the United States were American Indians or Native people or indigenous people. I don't care what you You know what I'm talking about. The people who were here to meet the boat when Columbus shows up, right? Those people, even though they got here tens of thousands of years ago, before the first Europeans, they couldn't vote. So what did that leave to vote? Well, it left white, free men. And yet, even all of them could not vote. The general standard was, in order to vote, you had to be 21 years of age. And that varied from colony to colony and from state to state, but generally 21 for a long time was the minimum age in order to qualify to vote. But there were other qualifications in addition to age. Um, in some places, you had to be the member of a particular church in order to qualify to vote. There was a religious qualification to be able to vote. In many states, there was a property qualification in order to be able to vote. In other words, you had to own property, pardon me, that had a minimum monetary value. And if your property was worth less than whatever that bottom limit was, you could not vote. So, the bottom line is this, that at the beginning of our country, in many states, only adult white property owning, tax paying, church going men could vote. Now, fortunately, um, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Constitution was ratified in 1789, we're going to discover, but it was not until 1920 that women received the right to vote constitutionally in all elections. African Americans were officially given the right to vote in the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution in the 1860s and early 1870s. But the reality is that as soon as the right to vote was given to them, it began to be taken away from them. African Americans were effectively disfranchised. Now, there's a new word, franchise. What does a franchise mean? It means the vote. Okay? And to be disfranchised means that you have lost the right to vote. Many African Americans, most African Americans, especially in the southern states, have been effectively disfranchised um, in up until the 1960s. Isn't that amazing? It was not until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was created by Congress, and a year later, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was created by Congress, that African Americans could effectively once again vote. So, between the time that they were given the right to vote initially and the time that they were uh, given the right to vote again officially, it's almost 100 years. And as a result, women have been voting for 90 years, and blacks have only been able to vote since 1964, 1965. So the question is, do we have a democracy? That's what started this entire conversation, if you recall. The idea that the framers of the Constitution feared too much democracy, that they thought that the right to govern the country should be in the hands of the elites of society, the well educated, the well connected, the wealthy. So, do we have a democracy today? Well, that's a real difficult question to answer. It's hard, many of you as students, you like those yes no questions, right? Those true false questions. But there's really no way to answer the question using true false. There's no way to answer the question, do we have a democracy today. Because we've only recently, in historical terms, extended the right to vote to women and people of color, which I say is the right to vote is the most fundamentally basic right that we as Americans have. It is uh, the method through which we are able to voice our opinions, the right to vote. You take away the right to vote, and you've taken away the most important right of citizenship. So, a legitimate question can be raised: how representative is a government in which, at one time, only white, adult, rich males could vote? Um, how can a government that has normally very low voter turnout, sometimes as low as 30%, only 30% of registered voters actually take the trouble to show up to vote? So, how can a government that is elected by only 30% of the eligible voters be a democracy? On top of that, to make it, I'm not doing this on purpose, but it becomes more complicated than that. Who actually runs our country? Which of the elected officials actually run the country? Well, you can make a strong case that there are a few families or a few groups in the United States which year after year after year hold many important public offices. Think about it for just a moment. Let's pull up some names from American history. Uh, the Harrison family. In the 1800s, there were two Harrisons who served as president of the United States: William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. In the early 20th century, uh, there were a couple of Roosevelt presidents, right? Theodore and Franklin. As we move forward in history, the Kennedy family has made an important contribution to American politics. John Kennedy was elected president. His brother Robert was elected a United States senator, and before his assassination, many folks thought that he would someday become the president as well. Their younger brother, Teddy, served as a U.S. senator from the state of Massachusetts for decades. That's just one family. Plus, there were nephews who served in lesser capacity as well. So the Kennedy family has been a force in American politics for a long time. Still are. Uh, Coming forward, we have the Bush family. Uh, George H.W. Bush was our 41st president. Then a few years later, his son, George W. Bush, became the 43rd president. Bill Clinton served as our 44th president, and his wife Hillary came really, really, really close to being elected president herself. So, um, when certain groups or certain families have a great amount of influence and power, can we truly say, that we have a democracy? Some people say that the form of government that we have is actually a form of government by elite rule. That America is ruled by a small number of people who exercise power and authority to further their own political goals. This perspective contends that the masses, that's us, that the masses, the majority of American people lack both the knowledge and an interest in politics. Now, think about that little statement for just a moment. So, elite rule, democracy by the few, democracy by the wealthy, democracy by the important, democracy by the well educated, right? The elites. And then there are others who say that we have that our government is something we call pluralism. And to simplify that, this would be considered democracy by groups. Some political scientists argue that the real force behind the decision-making process is not the elites, it's not the Kennedys and the Bushes and Clintons, but rather it's powerful special interest groups who really run the country. They provide the money and they provide the electoral support to elect the elites. This is the notion of rule by special interest. Think of the special interest groups that have a lot of influence in American politics right now. Now, I don't want to identify myself as left or right or conservative or progressive. I just simply ask you to consider what I'm getting ready to say. Some of the most influential groups in American politics are, for example, AARP, retired people, right? Look, there are a lot of people like me. Come on now, you can look at my face and you know that I'm no spring chicken. AARP supposedly represents the interest of older people. They have a lot of influence. How about the NRA, the National Rifle Association? There are millions of Americans who own firearms. Now, I don't really care whether you like firearms or not. The reality is that the NRA has a lot of influence because they do represent people who own firearms. How about Ducks Unlimited, for goodness sakes, right? Ducks Unlimited has a lot of influence. You don't think about that, but think of all the Americans who are hunters, specifically those who hunt waterfowl. They don't want to lose the right to hunt. And so they join organizations like Ducks Unlimited. How about the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union? Those folks have a lot of influence in our government because uh, they say that the reason that they exist is to make sure that your constitutional rights are not violated. How about the oil and gas industry? Oh my, there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of influence there. The American Medical Association, the AMA, right? Doctors speak up and want to have some type of a role in legislation. So, this democracy by groups, which we refer to as pluralism, let me spell that one, Pluralism, pluralism, pluralists, rather, argue that politics is and should be a battle between interests to secure policies that benefit their members. Not so much concerned about the members of other groups, but they're concerned about their group. Special interest politics. Many voters base their vote on single issues. We all know people who uh, base their vote, base who they're going to vote for on what that candidate's stand is on abortion rights, um, race politics, uh, defense issues, environmental issues. Some argue that pluralism is good because with as many competing interests, it prevents one interest from becoming dominant. There's something to be said for that idea. Now, another form of theoretical form of rule. Now, have we mentioned so far? Elite rule, which is democracy by the few. Pluralism, which is democracy by groups. Here's a third one: majority rule, which is democracy by the people. Those who believe in majority rule assert that the real power is in the hands of the people, that the political elites and the special interest groups must give way when the majority interest is concerned. Do we, in fact, have majority rule? That's what we've been taught in junior high and high school, and maybe even here at the university level. Do we have majority rule? Well, you can make a strong case that we do. Go out on the street and ask a guy, how do we determine how do we determine those who win elections? And many people will say we do that by majority rule. The guy who gets the most votes wins. And then every once in a while, you'll come across one of my students and you ask him the same question: how do we determine who wins elections? And that student will say, uh, the winners are not always the people who get the most votes. And that seems to be a contradiction in terms in a democracy where the people, right, majority rule supposedly rules. Well, let me ask you, here's meat for thought. Hillary Clinton. No, let's go back. Let's go back to 2000. In the year 2000, George W. Bush won the election, but his opponent had more votes than he did. Later, Hillary Clinton lost the election, and she had millions of votes more than the eventual winner. In the election of 2016, that was the one, right? Hillary Clinton had more popular votes than Donald Trump, but Trump became the president because of the electoral system that we use here in America. And we're going to go into that in a lot of detail. But my point is this: the guy who gets the majority of the votes doesn't always come out to be the winner. And it's perfectly constitutional when that happens. In 2016, many people were saying, oh, that's so wrong. That's unconstitutional that Trump could become the president, and yet Hillary Clinton had the most popular votes. No, no, it was not unconstitutional. It was very constitutional. Now, if you think that the Electoral College is a thing of the past and needs to be changed, then what must we do? We need to amend the Constitution. But until the Constitution is amended, the Electoral College is what we've got. And people who are elected through the Electoral College, who actually have fewer popular votes than the loser, until that happens, that's what we're stuck with. So let me ask the question again: does America have a democracy? Well, it's sort of. That's the answer. Sort of, maybe. What type of democracy or rule does America have? Well, uh, primarily, it's what we like to call an indirect democracy. In an indirect democracy, the people elect their leaders, and then that's direct democracy, right? The people elect members of the United States House of Representatives. People elect members of the United States Senate, so that is certainly is direct democracy. That's by, government by the people. But once we elect those members of the House of Representatives or the members of the Senate, then we trust them to make rules, pass laws, and we then promise to obey those laws. Now, in theory, we have no choice when a law, pardon me, when a law, I got the hiccups, a law is passed, and we'll go into great detail on that process a little later. But for right now, let me tell you that when a law is passed, we don't have a choice. We must obey that law. It doesn't really matter whether you like that law or not. And of course, that's causing problems, isn't it? For example, uh, buying marijuana is a federal crime. It's on the books today. If by federal law, if you buy marijuana, you are a criminal and you can be prosecuted and you can go to jail. However, a number of states they have legalized marijuana, right? Colorado being the perfect example. You can walk into pot shops all over Colorado and buy reasonable amounts of pot for supposedly for your own use. Now, there is a built-in conflict, isn't it? The federal law says it's illegal, but the state law says it's legal. So who's going to win that argument? Well, I suspect that someday that case is going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is simply going to have to decide which side. Because the law should not be like going to a Piccadilly restaurant. When you go to the Piccadilly restaurant, you get your tray and you get your silverware and you start going down the serving line, and you have all of these options. You have all these choices to make. Oh yes, give me that steak. Uh, give me that green salad. Give me that chocolate cake. Liver? Oh, I don't think so. Leave the liver. Save that for somebody else, right? The law is not like the Piccadilly where you can pick and choose. You can pick and choose the food that you want, but as an American citizen, officially, you don't have the right to pick and choose the laws that you will obey or disobey. We are obligated to obey all of them. And yet we know the reality is, right, just the marijuana laws being a really good example, we know that that's not always the case. And it's very confusing. So, what kind of a rule do we have? What kind of government do we have? Well, our system is a mix of elitism, pluralism, and majority rule. And that is not all bad. There's a strong case to be made that the United States is not really as democratic as we like to think. And whether elites and special interest groups hold disproportionate power in the United States is a serious question that really has not yet been resolved. All right, that is a very brief overview of our system of government. Now, what I would like to do right now is to absolutely change gears, to change the direction of of the course right here in mid-lecture. And let's go back, please, to the colonial period in American history. And let's talk about the events that led up to the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. Now, we all know, I hope that we all know, that that the United States was at one point in time a colony of the British Empire. Over the years, there were different kings who governed the colonies. There were different prime ministers who whose job it was to carry out the orders of the British kings and queens. Uh, in the 1700s, uh, we have all been to parties where a party game called musical chairs was played, right? You have a group of people. You have, for example, 10 people, but you've only got 9 chairs, and the music starts, and you start walking around the chairs. And when the music stops, you got to grab a chair. And the person who can't find a chair is tossed out of the game, right? Musical chair. Something similar happened in England in the early and middle 1700s that was suspiciously similar to a game of musical chairs. Prime ministers came and went. Sometimes it was difficult to figure out who was in charge because the prime ministers were changing so often. Well, one of the prime ministers of England in the 1700s, the 18th century, was a man by the name of Charles Townsend. Let me spell that one for you. Townsend. Now, it looks like it should be Townshend, right? No, it's not. It's Townsend. Townsend was prime minister in the 1760s, and Townsend was responsible for many of the policies that led the British policies toward the colonies that led to the the American Revolution. The last war that England was involved in before the American Revolution was a war that we called the French and Indian War. And of course, the British won that. The, the French almost, the French never could really defeat the British. Uh, and that trend continued with the French and Indian War. Now, prior to the French and Indian War, England and France had fought a series of wars that go back into the 1600s. And there was one thing that was in common all those wars. It was very simple. The English always won and the French always lost. And many of those wars, most of those wars, were not only fought in Europe between the French and the British, but they were fought in North America between the French and the British. Now, the British colonies, the British 13 colonies, had been created by then. And whenever the British Army was sent to North America to fight the French here, there were always colonial soldiers, colonial militia men who assisted the British because we considered ourselves to be British. And the British always won. And one of the reasons they always won was because of the help of the colonial militia against the French. And to show their appreciation, the British footed the bill for the wars. Many American soldiers, many colonial militia men were killed fighting the French. And the British government appreciated that, and they appreciated it to such a degree that they never made the colonists pay for any expense associated with the war. What the British said was, you have shed your blood for England, and that is a high price to pay, so we're not going to ask you to pay any more. Now, the French and Indian War was the most expensive war that England had ever fought at any time, at any place. And so, at the end of the French and Indian War, now the same thing had happened, right? The colonial militia had assisted the British government in defeating the French army in North America. But at the end of the French and Indian War, something unique happens. It had been such an expensive war that the British, for the first time, made it plain that they expected the colonists to pay their fair share of the war. And that had never happened before. And you can imagine how upset the colonists were. They felt that they were being picked on. They felt that it was unfair. Well, the British government stuck by their demands. They wanted to, what they preferred was that the colonies voluntarily pay their fair share of the French and Indian War, and the colonists refused. So what the British did, the British still wanted the colonists to pay for their fair share of the war, but now that the colonists have refused to voluntarily do it, the British decided that they were going to force the Americans to do it. And the result was a series of laws passed that were designed to raise money to be sent back to England to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. Among those laws uh, were things like the sugar tax and the tea tax and things like that. Things that we all are rather familiar with from our junior high, high school, and even your college history courses. Excuse me. I don't know what it is. Pollen in the air. I don't know. Uh, and the colonists resisted that too, didn't they? And the British were absolutely outraged that the colonists would stand up to the British government, which was at that time the most powerful nation in the entire world. And here these smart aleck upstart colonists were refusing to do what they had been ordered to do. Now, let me introduce a few terms here. We as Americans today we consider ourselves to be citizens. And because we are citizens, we have certain rights. And as I mentioned before, one of our most important, one of our most precious rights as citizens is the right to vote. Well, back when back when what became the United States was still a British colony, those people who lived in the 13 colonies were not citizens; they were subjects. And there's a huge difference between being a subject and being a citizen. Literally, a subject really has no say so in his government. A subject has one obligation and one obligation only, and that is to obey the orders of the king or the queen. So we were subjects, and in the eyes of the British government, we had no choice but to obey. And yet here we are choosing to disobey. So you can imagine how angry the British government was at the colonists. Of course, the colonists were mad at the British government for doing something that they had never done to us before, and that is making us pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. When the colonists refused to obey, the British government punished us, and they created laws. For example, the Revenue Act. The Revenue Act of 1767 was the first law that had ever been created by the British government for the specific purpose of raising money to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. Now, the British government had passed laws before that collected tax money from the colonists, but generally that tax money then was turned right around and it was spent in the colonies. And so the colonists themselves received the benefit of the money that they had paid in taxes. The Revenue Act was totally different. The Revenue Act, that money didn't stay in the colonies. That money was sent to London. That money was sent to the British Treasury, and its purpose was to help pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. Smuggling was a really important uh, financial activity during the colonial period. The British government had passed a series of laws called the Navigation Act. And fundamentally, what the Navigation Acts had nothing to do with navigation. The Navigation Acts had everything to do with trying to control American business, especially American business on the high seas. One of the things that the navigation, and there were a number of navigation acts over the years. There was not just one navigation act, right? Series of them. But what all of them had in common was an attempt, quite often unsuccessful, to control the American economy. In other words, uh, if the Americans wanted to ship fish to the rest of the world, they had to use a British ship. It had to have a British crew. It had to have a British captain, right? It could only go to British ports. In other words, the Navigation Acts tried to create laws that were very favorable economically to England. And if it hurt the colonies, so be it. Right? And as a result, smuggling became very common in the colonies. We as Americans have always been willing to disobey laws with which we do not agree. And this is nothing new. I mean, think about Dr. Martin Luther King. There were laws on the books all over the South that said that black children could not go to school with white children. There's a law, right? What did Dr. King say? The law is unjust. And he began to work for the desegregation of schools. Another word is integration of schools. They both pretty much mean the same thing, to integrate or to desegregate. And guess what happened? Eventually, the laws were changed, weren't they? So, Dr. King is a good example of how Americans have always been willing to disobey laws with which we do not agree. And this goes way back. This was taking place in the colonial period. Americans were willing to disobey the Navigation Acts, but they still needed to sell their stuff, didn't they? And they wanted to buy stuff from other countries. And so, how do you do it? If you can't do it legally, you do it illegally by smuggling stuff out of the U.S. or out of the colonies. It's not the U.S. yet, right? Smuggling stuff out of the colonies and sending it to other countries, or smuggling stuff from other countries back into the colonies. Smuggling was a big deal, and you could become very wealthy if you could avoid being caught by the British Navy and unload your cargo. You could become wealthy overnight. Well, um, whenever the British government caught smugglers, of course, they arrested them and they put them in jail, and they tried them for illegal smuggling. The problem, of course, was that the members of the jury that tried the smuggling cases, those juries were composed of uh, colonists, and the colonists sympathized with the smugglers. They understood that the smuggler had broken the law, but they said that's a good thing, right? They were willing to break a law with which they disagreed. And so quite often the smuggler, I mean, he was caught red-handed, right? There was no doubt that he was guilty, guilty, guilty. And yet the jury who sympathized with him would turn him loose. That angered the British government. And so these smuggling cases, rather than being tried in American colonial courts where there was a good chance that the smuggler would be turned loose, the British government moved those cases, those trials, to Canada. Now, Canada, right north of the 13 colonies, was also at that time owned by England, but it was a separate country. It was not a part of the of what became the United States. Uh, in Canada, the British felt that they could get a more sympathetic jury. They could get a jury of Canadians to hear an American case. And of course, this outraged the Americans because one of the most precious rights of an Englishman was the right to a trial by a jury of your peers. Now, what does that mean, folks? Sometimes we don't really think we've heard that term. We don't really understand what that term means. What is a jury of your peers? Well, a peer, P-E-E-R, is a person who is just like you, right? In this case, the jury of your peers, one of the things that would make them just like you is that they were American colonists. But now those trials have been moved to Canada, and the jury is no longer composed of your peer group. And so this really angered the Americans. All of these laws, the Revenue Act, the moving of smuggling courts to Canada, things like that, were all a part of what we refer to as the Townsend Act. Remember Prime Minister Charles Townsend? And the Townsend Acts generally were extraordinarily unpopular with the colonists. Now, the English thought that they were very reasonable, right, and sensible, but not the colonists. Colonists saw it as a slap in the face. And the colonists began to resist. Now, we're not talking about the American Revolution yet. That is still in the future. But this is the foundation of what becomes the American Revolution. The colonists began to resist in passive ways, not military ways, but in passive ways. For example, all over the country, in all of the 13 colonies, to a greater or a lesser degree, the colonists agreed to boycott British goods. Now, that's a good word, boycott. In this case, what boycott means is that the colonists agreed not to buy British goods. Now, The British colonies in North America they were an important uh, part of the British economy. Uh, the the colonies were not industrialized yet, not even a little bit. And so, if you were a colonist and you wanted a nice set of clothes or nice furniture or whatever, you didn't go down to the corner shop and buy something that was made in America. The only thing that was available to you was to buy things that were made in England and shipped over here. So the colonists decided to start boycotting British made goods. What did that mean with regard to clothing? Well, uh, traditionally, uh, most people wore clothing that was sewn out of cloth that was made in England. But Americans began to boycott that material. Well, what do you have left? If you can't make the fabric and you refuse to buy the fabric from England, what do you have left? Well, what you have left is something called homespun. And that word describes exactly how it was created. The fabric was spun with American wool, usually not cotton, because cotton was a very expensive material back then. Uh, it was spun from wool, and then it was woven, and most of the clothing that Americans wore, that clothing was made from wool. Now, the factory made stuff in England was pretty high quality, but the homespun that Americans began to use was pretty rough looking stuff. There was no consistency in the quality. Uh, it looked as if it had been made by hand, and it certainly was. But people began to wear homespun fabric, clothing made of homespun fabric, as a sign that they were resisting the British navigation law. It also did something else that was sort of unexpected. It forced Americans to begin uh, weaving their own cloth in factories. As a result, so we can legitimately say that one of the outcomes of the colonial resistance to the British laws was the establishment of American industry. Now, it was very rudimentary. It was taking baby steps. Uh, Today, we would look back on it and we would say, well, not a lot was happening. But if you had been alive in that time, you would have been appreciative of the fact that you could actually buy American made fabric to which to make your clothing. It's important for us to understand that very few people in 1767 supported any kind of a revolution against England. The colonists considered themselves to be, write this down, they considered themselves to be Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen. And that's extraordinarily important. Englishmen generally considered themselves to be very fortunate to be Englishmen, right? Uh, Englishmen could vote. Well, some could. Uh, when you compare England to some other countries of Europe, the Englishmen had a lot more rights than if you were a subject in France or Spain. So to be an Englishman was a really good thing. In the year 1619, now I'm going back more than 150 years. In 1619, the British government voluntarily said to the colonists, "You are Englishmen." And not only are you Englishmen, you have the rights of Englishmen. Now, what are some of the rights of an Englishman? In no particular order of importance, the right to vote is the right of an Englishman. The right to a trial by jury. We've already mentioned both these things. Not only a trial by jury, but a trial by jury by a jury of your peers. Uh, Another right of an Englishman is to not be forced to pay taxes unless you had representation in Parliament. And so voluntarily, the British government in 1619 gave to the British colonists in North America those rights. And they said specifically, you are an Englishman with the rights of Englishmen. It doesn't matter that you're 4,000 miles away from England in America, you are still an Englishman. It's the same as if you lived in England. And so in 1767, a man who lived in Pennsylvania by the name of John Dickinson. Dickinson wrote a letter to his local newspaper, uh, and the newspaper printed it on the editorial page. And Dickinson signed it. He didn't sign his name. He signed it uh, a letter from a Pennsylvania farmer. Okay? And in that letter, Dickinson used very moderate language. It was very calm, right? Dickinson didn't ask to go to war with England. Uh, what Dickinson did do, though, he said the the British the British have the right to tax the colonists if that money is going to be used to help the colonists, because that's the way it had always been. But what Dickinson said that really enraged the British, he said the British do not have the right to tax us just to raise money to go into the British treasury to be used to pay for the cost of the French. And that seems like a small thing to us today, but that was a huge thing in 1767. Now, Dickinson's letter to his local paper, and I don't know where, probably it was a Philadelphia paper since he was from Pennsylvania, but Dickinson's letter was what we call, as historians, we call them circular letters. You know how when you throw a stone into a pond, how the ripples go out, 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 out? That's the way a circular letter was used. For example, Dickinson wrote this letter to what we think is a Philadelphia paper. And then somebody, for example, from South Carolina who might be visiting in Philadelphia would read the paper and would see Dickinson's letter. And he would say, wow, that guy's sharp. I like his ideas. I agree with his ideas. And he would take a copy of that paper back to South Carolina with him when he returned home. And he would take it to his local newspaper and show the letter to the editor there and ask the editor to print it in his editorial page. And so, like the little ripples on a pond, it might have taken some time, but eventually letters like this would be printed all over the colonies. And they were referred to as circular letters. Another circular letter that was written during this general period was written by the name of a man by the name of Samuel Adams. And yes, that Samuel Adams. uh, Adams was from Boston. He was a Harvard grad. He had inherited a family brewery. By the way, the Samuel Adams beer that is sold today has no relationship to that original brewery. The only relationship it has is the name, okay? Because Sam Adams was a great revolutionary. Uh, many people refer to Adams as the supreme genius of revolutionary agitation. The governor of Massachusetts would later call Adams the most dangerous man in Massachusetts. But Adams wrote his own circular letter, and it was circulated in a manner very similar to that was used to circulate John Dickinson's letter. And in his circular letter, Sam Adams sort of restated, sort of recapitulated the thoughts that had been contained in uh, John Dickinson's letter. All right. This has been lecture 2 of Political Science 201. I'm going to stop it here, and we'll pick up our thoughts in lecture 3. So I'll see you soon.